This is a re-recording of technical advances. The first one had an audio issue. So these are the notes we're working from. First, we have the question of Charles Wheaton and David Brewster. They created the stereoscopic camera. The stereoscopic camera was a camera with two lenses, roughly the width of your eyes, and whatever they photographed with a slightly offset by the distance of your eyes, any scene, and it could be printed as a double image. This double image could be placed in a stereoscopic viewer, and I will do this for you. There's a little bracket you can feed it into. So once in, you could view it. And as you held it to your face, it was authentically three-dimensional. These were a huge hit in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. They were very popular as, instead of postcards you'd mail, you would travel and you could buy these from your travels. This is from Granada, Spain. And this is some royal court in Europe. And you could buy your own. You still can, and make these if you wish. These can be found easily online, relatively cheap. Buyer beware, this one has a jagged edge, so I wouldn't want to cut your face against it. But it is very cool. These are the very first stereoscopic viewers. And Wheaton and Brewster are credited with that. The next name on your list is Hermann Wilhelm Vogel, film sensitivity. In the 19th century, film only recognized for all practical purposes the color blue. Anything red or green just fell away. People with brown eyes had basically black eyes, and blue-eyed people like me had like zombie eyes. Vogel noticed that he was a photochemist, and he was working with something called an anti-halation filter. When light goes through film, it bounces off the back and flares back and creates hazes around, a haze around things. So an anti-halation filter is a dark coating on the back of film that basically eats light as soon as it hits the back wall. For those of you who've done analog photography and you pre-soak your film before you develop it, pour it in developer, as you pour out the pre-soak, you'll notice it has a green haze. That is anti-halation. Now, he was experimenting with anti-halation filters, and he noticed that certain dyes he mixed, aniline dyes they were known as, that he would mix, would suddenly sensitize the film to green or red or orange. And this was a breakthrough in film. Those films were called monochromatic. They only saw one color blue, but panchromatic films of today can see that are sensitive to the spectrum. Films can even be made sensitive to infrared or ultraviolet light. And this is credited to Hermann Wilhelm Vogel. Richard Maddox. Richard Maddox came up with something called dry plate. You'll remember that there was called a wet plate collodion that had to be developed quickly while it was still wet. And he made a breakthrough into what's called dry plate. It was glass in, but today it's just flexible film. Now this film is ruined because it's out of the box, but this film can be made and exposed later and developed even much later. And that was the advantage of dry plate, is that you didn't need to make it right now, shoot it right now, and develop it right now. Dry plate gave you the flexibility of time to travel, photograph some, develop it later. And that is Richard Maddox. Frederick Voigtlander. Voigtlander was a maker of lenses in the 19th century. He made the best lenses. These were lenses that were faster. They could basically bring in more light, so shorter exposures could be made and shorter exposure times could be achieved. Portrait photography, action photography both benefited from the work of Frederick Voigtlander. Auguste and Louis Lumiere. Now they Hold on. I have a roll of film here, so here we are. They didn't invent, but they made good use of the sprockets of film. They made the first movies. They also made the first color photography, which we're going to see later when we get to color. But they would employ these sprockets to make movies. Now, there was an exposition in France, and they had their color prints up, their color photography. They also showed short movies. They were sure that their color photographs would be the big hit. No, people were fascinated by moving pictures. Now, they didn't think then to make stories, although they did it later, but their first movies were people coming out of a factory, a train stops and people get off the train. You know, by today's standards, really dull, mundane stuff. But for the audience, seeing people actually moving successfully, it was a very big deal. George Eastman was a banker in Rochester, New York, but he was also an amateur photographer, and he'd been following developments. He was reading periodicals on photography out of England, and he'd heard that they had come up with a dry plate process. He'd also heard that they have a flexible backing that you can use, and he made this into a film. This is not a Kodak film, but it's in principle the same thing. He cultivated the idea of roll film. So this film is roll film, and at a certain point, there is film in here that can roll up. And his first cameras were brownies. This is a brownie camera, not one of the very first. Those are collector's items. I don't know, I couldn't possibly afford one of those. They're all in his museum in Rochester, New York. But this is an old brownie. Verticals, you view this viewfinder. Horizontals, you look through this viewfinder. And hear that? The shutter still works. As you advance the film, you look through a little red window on the back. And where's that roll of film I was waving around a minute ago? On the back of the paper, there are numbers. So as the paper is advancing, you track the numbers so you know you've got fresh film behind the lens when you take a picture. George Eastman never married. George Eastman made a fortune, an absolute fortune. He was famously hard to work for. He fired people and rehired them immediately. He was a real taskmaster. One of the things Kodak did was you could buy one of their cameras for $25, which was no small matter in the 1890s. 25 bucks was a bunch of money. And it held 100 exposures on a roll of film. You could take 100 pictures. They were all circular negatives. And you'd mail the whole camera back to Rochester. They would take the film out, develop it, make prints, reload the camera, and mail it back to you reloaded. And their motto was, take the picture and we'll do the rest. You snap the picture and we will do the rest. And it was a great motto. One of his acts of incredibly ingenious marketing, at one point they announced that every child under the age of 12 will be given a free brownie camera on a certain day. And so people lined up, you know, around the block, and their kids got free cameras. The genius of this is we have all these people who want film and want film and want film and want film and want film. So their film sales, of course, succeeded dramatically. Now, George Eastman, when he was 78, he had cancer. He threw a party at his home in Rochester, New York. Now, this is a really very successful man. He had given money to the United States for World War I, and afterwards totally, you know, forgave the entire debt. He knew presidents. On his birthday, on this day when he was 78, he threw a party, and in the afternoon, he told everybody just to go home. He went upstairs, took out a piece of paper and wrote a note, and he said, "My work is done, why wait?" And he put a gun in his mouth, and that was the end of that story. That was the life of George Eastman. Ernst Leitz ran a company that made microscopes, but then they stepped into cameras. And while this is not a Leica camera, This is a Russian camera called a Fied. My wife speaks Russian, so I can't read this, but she can. And it looks very much like a Leica. In design, it's quite a bit like a Leica. And here's another Russian camera. As you can see, there's very similar designs. So that's the closest I have. He's showing you a Leica. Leicas are quite expensive. They are incredibly expensive. And if your Leica is smashed and you can bring the remains to it back to Leica, they'll apparently just give you another one. They're famously durable. They're great cameras, but I'm not going to get one. Now, next on the list is Harold Edgerton. Harold Edgerton was a scientist at MIT, and he developed what we call strobe. This, first of all, I want to show you a few things. These are a sample of capacitors. For those of you who've ever taken apart a transistor radio, you saw little cans look like soup cans with 3 prongs coming out, and you saw little things look like Tootsie Rolls with color bands and 2 wires. Those are resistors. The cans are called transistors. They steer the electricity. These are capacitors. Capacitors build a charge and release it as a pulse. Whenever you're riding down the road and you see a bicyclist and his taillight's going blink, blink, that is the release of electricity through a capacitor. Now, one of my students a few years ago decided to convert, he's one of the smartest students I ever had, decided to convert his digital camera into a infrared camera. So he opened up the camera without realizing that one of the capacitors in the camera still held a charge. And basically it knocked him out of a chair. These things hold a significant charge. This capacitor could kill you. This is the kind of capacitor that's in a strobe pack. I got this from the guy who fixes my strobe, but this is not one of my dead strobes. And what they do is the charge goes through a flash tube. You'll notice there's 3 prongs here, and you'll notice that 2 prongs are close together and 1 prong is set aside. The 2 that are together have glass that comes up, goes around the top and drops down the other side. And if you look closely, there's a wire going around that glass tube. Here's the key. The gases in there are xenon, rayon, and I think krypton. That's really a gas. And they are inert gases. So the electricity doesn't go through it, but when your camera takes a picture, your camera has a, do we have a good example here? Your camera has an attachment here that feeds to the strobe pack and sends a burst of electricity through that wire. And when that happens, the gases in there for an instant have a north pole and a south pole. The surge of this juice goes through it, and those gases flash, and you have white light for a burst. And that is the flash. So Harold Edgerton solved this, and the accomplishment of flash photography is to show us what happens on extremely short periods of time, so we can photograph it and see things that have unfolded right under our eyes that happen so fast we couldn't see it. By the way, the flash in most of your cameras is probably 30 watt seconds. This is out of a pack that has 2,400 watt seconds. So vast amounts of light can be achieved. Edwin Land was another whiz kid of MIT. And apparently one day he was in New York City and it was a rainy night. He was walking down Broadway and the approaching cars had a glare on that were shining off the road. He was like covering his eyes. Now, you and I would cover our eyes. He looked at that and said, I'm going to fix that. And he came up with the Polaroid filter, the polarizing filter that cuts the light way down to where you're not looking at glare on shiny metal, glare on water. He solved that. And he became quite successful that way. And later he was taking a picture of apparently his 5-year-old child. And his little 5-year-old, and he said, I want to see the picture. And he said, well, no, I have to develop the film and I have to make it. Yeah, I want to see the picture now. And being the indulgent father was, goes, you're right, you should be able to see the picture now. He cultivated the Polaroid camera. I have 3 of them here. So this is called a 1-step, which is kind of what I started with when I was, you know, a 15-year-old. This is a Sun 600. And this is one of the earliest Polaroid cameras. And you take a picture and then you pull it out and you'd wait. In the earliest days, like 5 minutes, you peel it apart and there was a picture there. And what happened was light hit the film, and where light hit the film, the black dust there was stuck. But when you pulled it apart, the black component would migrate. Where the light didn't hit it, the black component would migrate, and that would give the appearance of shadows. And it was a very successful system. Into the 1990s, when I was still doing a lot of commercial work and I would shoot Polaroid, and you don't know when a flash goes up where the light went and where the light didn't. You'd pull a Polaroid as well to see what really happened. Let me get these out of the way. I have a lot of stuff on my desk right now. A couple more points on Edwin Land. Edwin Land was pretty brilliant. At MIT, he never did his homework, so that he wouldn't flunk. His wife would take his homework and read the questions to him, and he would look up from whatever he was doing, just tell her the answer, and she'd write it down. So she collected his homework, delivered it in her handwriting, and he got really good grades, but I think he dropped out of MIT. Edwin Land is number 2 in America for the number of patents he personally holds. He holds over 500 patents, or did in his life. Only Thomas Edison held more. Thomas Edison held over 1,000 patents. Edwin Land he would do an experiment every day, and he would have teams of guys that would follow him around who were lab techs, would keep up with him. And when one crew was just exhausted, the next crew would step in, almost passing the baton. At one point, he apparently went 18 days without changing his clothes. He was so busy doing the experiments. George Smith and Willard Boyle. 1969, Bell Labs, New Jersey. These 2 guys sit down over a cup of coffee. This is the story. And decide that they want to come up with an electronic way of recording light, and in 1 hour think up the pixel, which is the principal picture element of a digital camera. They figured that out rather quickly and developed that whole system. Now, the thing I want to tell you is this about, let me get these things out of the way before I knock something really knocks something over here. All these cameras are precious to me. So I'll ask you, do you recognize this? DVD. You recognize this? This is a 100 floppy. You recognize this? Anybody? It's called a jazz drive. You recognize this? This is a 440 megabyte SideQuest. Each one of these would hold 1 image. They're about $60 each to get a cartridge. And maybe you recognize this. This is a laser disc. This is Sleepless in Seattle. And this one is Top Gun. And in its day, this was like the coolest way to look at a movie. What is this? I'll give you a hint. This is a 6-inch floppy. What I've just shown you is my lifetime. Every one of these was the end game of technology. Whenever you buy your digital camera, whenever you buy your computer, you've bought it 6 months too soon, and you're not going to be able to beat that. So technology moves at an astounding rate all the time. I know I'm going to pull out something else, one more thing. So I went to my camera doctor, asked if he has any. These are the little digital chips that come out of a digital camera. This is called the target instead of film. It's referred to as the target that the camera focuses on to record an image. And this is what Smith and Boyle came up with. This is their idea. They did that in 1969. In 2009, they both got the Nobel Prize in Physics. It took the Nobel Prize Committee 40 years to figure out what the importance of their achievement. So they both took a Nobel Prize in Physics for what they had done. Now, the next name you see is Leland Stanford. Is that familiar? Stanford University. In the 1880s, Leland Stanford was governor of California. He's also considered one of the big four who brought the trains to California, along with William Huntington and Charles Crocker. And the other guy, the fourth guy, was a very particular accountant, and when he died, they destroyed all his records. Bit of scandal going on there. Leland Stanford got into a bet with somebody that when a horse is running, that horse at some point has all of his feet off the ground. And the other person said, no, that horse always has at least 1 foot on the ground. So Leland Stanford retained the talents of Edward Muybridge. Now note the spelling. My name is Edwards. I know how to spell Edward, but he decided he was going to spell his name in what he thought was the true Celtic or Gaelic spelling, I guess. And his name was Edward Muggeridge. I would change my name too. He changed it to Muybridge. Edward Muybridge. And he was a Western photographer of landscapes. He did things like Yosemite. And Stanford asked him if he can solve the question of how to photograph an animal moving. And Muybridge said, yeah, I gotta get out of town, because he had murdered his wife's lovers. He had to get out of town for a while until things cooled off. He came back and he solved that. He set up a wall with 16 cameras, each one tripped by a string. They were 21 inches apart, and a horse would run through it. And every time a horse hit a string, pop, 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 he would make an exposure of a horse. And this led to the beginning of what we would call the movies. Muybridge he made it his specialty just to photograph people and animals in motion. The University of Pennsylvania gave him his own facility to explore this and to pursue this. So he photographed people in sports, people in action, and animals running and doing things to get all the mechanics of their bodies. Etienne Jules Marey, another photographer who pursued motion. He devised a camera gun so he could just pull a trigger and take pictures of things in motion, and he photographed birds a lot. Lumiere brothers, we've already, August. Did I mention them on the previous page, didn't I? Lumiere. I did. Motion pictures and color. Ernst Mach. Think Mach speed. The speed of sound was studying sound and its speed, but he's not really a photographer. Zopraxicope. Where is that thing? A zopraxicope is a circular disc with slits, and as you crank it, this thing spins with action in motion. So you can only look at one at a time, and it creates that sense of motion. Think of those things when you go to an arcade and you crank them like this, and you can see people running and action. The beginning of animation, the beginning of the movies. So this would be, I bought this online. It's just a digital copy of a Zopraxicope plate that would spin around. with his little slits, and it's a person standing on a horse doing a backflip. But people thought that was very, very cool. So now I want to fire up a PowerPoint, and I'm hoping this will be successful. So let's give it a shot. And the PowerPoint is called Technical Advances. Stereoscopic photography. This is Charles Wheaton. Looks rather formal. And he developed the camera. This is Sir David Brewster. I guess they were knighted for what they did. And they developed stereoscopic photography. Here is an example from the Swiss Alps of guys climbing up a glacier in stereoscopic photography. This is in Broadway, New York City, from 18th Street in stereoscopic. So if you were to put this in a stereoscopic viewer, you'd see a sense of depth. Children at play on a rainy day, what's called rainy day sports. Now, this is a man showing stereoscopic photography to a gentleman, and apparently at the same time sneaking his kiss off the guy's wife while the guy is distracted. This is a photograph I think you've seen before. I think I showed it at the very beginning of this class, family setting. This is a man giving a geography lesson to his, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 girls, and knows every child has a hand at doing something so the hands don't move. So this goes back to longer exposures when you had to stand really still for a picture. This is hand-colored, the hand-colored stereograph from the Victoria Albert Museum, London. It's called Quite a Hopeless Case. I don't know what that means. From 1856. And this is the Apple vendor. And these are little origamis arranged. Quite interesting. I'd like to actually, I would like very much to print this out and put it inside of a viewer and see how it looks. And a little horse, child's toy. This is what the camera looks like. Those lenses are about the distance of your eyes. And the back of the camera takes 2 pictures simultaneously from the shutter or tandem shutters of the same picture at the same time and winds it together. Now here's a Russian version. The lens in the middle is the viewer, and the 2 on the 2 lower lenses are for taking the picture. And here's how, this is a 2 1/4 and how big it looks in the back for larger film. Now, if you look on the left, that little red thing, that's the actual film where the film starts. This is David Brewster again and Charles Wheaton, creators of the stereographic camera. Hermann Wilhelm Vogel, color sensitivity. This guy has style, and he was a photochemist who discovered how to make film sensitive to the broader spectrum. Give me a second here. This is Richard Maddox. No. Anyway, back to Wilhelm, and this is his color sensitivity, one of his books, The Chemistry of Light and Photography. Now, here's an example of how white the sky was before Vogel's work. The sky would wash out completely white because if you only see blue, the camera can't tell a cloud from a blue sky. The film can't. And the same thing here. Notice the washed out sky. But with panchromatic film, you begin to see clouds. In this case, with his color sensitivity, you can differentiate a blue sky from a white cloud. Maddox. Now we're talking about dry plate photography. And before he came along, you would have to mix up your film in a dark tent, expose it immediately, develop it immediately. Here's a portable tent that you could take with you that's all, dark as a dark room on the inside. And here's a package of dry plate photography from Boston, Massachusetts. A dry plate negative. And that's Madison again. George Eastman, Kodak. George Eastman came into prominence in the late 1890s when he was formulating the Kodak company and into the early 1900s and through World War I. This is him as a young man. He worked for a bank. And that's a Brownie camera, very similar to the one I held up and showed you. And this is a roll film camera. Oh, I've got one of those I can show you at the end of this too. I forgot to pull it out. And a little tiny Brownie camera, Wines. I also have one of these. Now this, I'll have you know, is exactly the kind of camera I started out with as a little tiny kid. And I would have to wind my film on, take a picture, look from the top down, you flip that open, you look down, and the top lens is what you're looking through when you take a picture. Frederick Voigtlander. Voigtlander made the best lenses in Europe in the 19th century. They were a big development for all cameras. Now this is a brass camera for taking daguerreotypes by Voigtlander. And as you can see from this diagram, it says Leitz, true, but there are multiple pieces of glass in your camera, not just one round curved surface. Each piece is called an element and they're glued together with a special clear glue to be normal, telephoto, or wide angle. Ernst Leitz. This is Ernst Leitz, the founder of the Leica company, and they were the maker of microscopes, extremely high quality microscopes in their day. These are pretty gorgeous, but ultimately they stepped into cameras and it became the Leica camera. This is like one of the very early, like one of the very first Leica cameras. That would be worth a fortune. And this apparently is the first Leica camera, and it is worth a fortune. Probably not even for sale. This is a photograph taken with a Leica on a street in Germany. And that's, old man Ernst Leica is an old man. Now this is the work of Harold Edgerton. That's Edgerton himself, an MIT professor. Now, before he came along, the flash on the camera was this blue thing that burned, I think, manganese. They were blazing hot when they popped out. So you'd push a button and it would just pop out to the ground. This is an Instamatic, Kodak Instamatic, and it has 4 little flash tubes. They would pop and turn, and so you get 4 pictures out of that flash. But once the flash had gone off, that exact piece of flash was burned out and done. Here's a flash tube, the way Edgerton designed it. As you can see, there are 3 prongs. 2 prongs lead up to the gas chain, the gas tube, and the 3rd one is a wire that goes on the outside. Does not go on the inside, but the wire on the outside, which receives a signal from the camera as you take a picture, initiates a pulse that causes the gases on the inside to have a north pole and a south pole, and for an instant can support electric current. Here's another angle. Now, this is what it means to fire strobe. Multiple firings of strobe. This is a bullet going through a light bulb. Now, this is a gun firing. And the way you capture something like that on the bottom, that thing on the bottom is a microphone. The sound of the gun going off initiates the flash, which takes the picture. You and I would not be fast enough to capture this. This actually happens, before you grasp the fact that the gun's fired. So you need a microphone to do that. An acrobat, dancer. These are pretty exquisite. And this is a lit baton, that's my understanding. A baton twirler. A deck of cards. A bullet going through rubber bands. In an instant, rubber bands are just curling on the very tip. Diving board. This is a bullet hitting the speed of sound. Oh, you've already seen this shot. I should have pulled this one. Sorry, my apologies. A bullet going through a card. King of diamonds. And this is what happens when, this is a little bit of fluid physics here and how it behaves when a drop comes down and splashes. A bullet going through 3 balloons. You can see the bullet on the far right. Deck of cards. I need to eliminate a sneeze. A sneeze, the muzzle velocity of a sneeze is supposed to be 90 miles an hour, believe it or not. And this is Edgerton holding his hand. I wouldn't have my hand near a shooting bullet, but he's probably gotten used to it. Again, you see a microphone down there below. It looks like a golf club, but it's recording the sound of the gun going off and taking the picture. A bullet goes through an apple. Now, one of the upshots of Edgerton was Philip Halsman was a photographer for Time Life Publications, and he would photograph the celebrities of the world. And he would ask them at the end, would you jump for a photograph? And with the flash, you get these people airborne. There is a book called The Halsman Jump Book. And this is Richard Nixon, and then Vice President of the United States, jumping for the camera. And it's actually a great book of all these celebrities jumping for the camera. Edwin Land, of Polaroid fame. That's Land pulling a huge Polaroid of himself. And he's got looks like an Aztec 70. He just took a Polaroid of himself. That's very similar to the Polaroid camera that I was showing you a little while ago. Cover of Life magazine. Another Polaroid camera. And this is called a one-stop. I had one of these when I was like 15. You look through it and it says yes or no. Yes, you have good exposure. No, you don't. And look at that flash. Look at that flash bar on top. 1, 2. So you can take 5 pictures from that, and that's it. And then you throw it away. Landfill, what can I say? Another Polaroid camera. This one is a collapsible. It snaps together. And here is a picture with a whole spread, almost the history of Polaroid cameras. George Smith and Willard Boyle digital photography. Willard's on the left, George is on the right, I believe. And sorry about this, these are how pixelated these are, but I had to pull these off the internet and they wouldn't give me a quality picture. Early chips. This is one of the very first digital cameras. As you can see, it takes a cassette to hold the image on, a digital cassette. And that's how big it was. Convenient pocket size. Digital camera. And here is kind of a history of digital cameras from the first to point and shoots, little pocket size, and a commercial. And this one takes a memory card, which is 2 megabytes of RAM, I guess. Now this thing is the kind of camera I used in the early 20th century for a place I worked for. 21st century? No, 21st century. That camera, when a company bought it, cost just south of $9,000. And it was a state-of-the-art 1.25 megapixel chip, believe it or not. Now it's a doorstop somewhere. And here's Smith and Boyle getting their Nobel at the Nobel Awards. Motion photography. Leland Stanford, governor of California. This is Leland Stanford. He led a scandalous life. There was a book about him, about his scandalous life. Now down here, the Honorable Leland, president of the Central Pacific Railroad, and I see Crocker, Hopkins, Chaz Crocker, that's Charles, and then there's Huntington. Maybe Hopkins was the accountant, I don't know. And this was his home this is his home in Palo Alto, California. He had a fabulous home in San Francisco. It was like 4,000 square, he only had one child. And it was 4,000 square feet and it burned in the San Francisco earthquake. But this is his home in Palo Alto, California. Edward Muybridge, also known as Edward Muggeridge. This is Muybridge. I feel like calling him Muggeridge. And this is how he set up his process for photographing a horse running. On the back wall are cameras. And there are strings. When the horse runs through, now the horse will be seen from those cameras looking in our direction. So behind where we're viewing from now, there is a blank wall. And this is a shot of a buggy and birds in motion. But they would also photograph camels running, cats running, deer, people doing various exercises from multiple angles. Swinging a pick, sword fighting, pig, a woman dancing with a long gauzy dress, a woman jumping over a stool, down a flight of stairs, picking up a child, dumping water on a bathing woman, Murder in Motion, The Strange Life and Murder, Edward Muggeridge. So yes, he apparently did kill his wife's lover and he got off with it. He got away with it somehow. The Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis Lumiere. And this is a clip from the scene of women getting out of the factory. They basically invented the movies. This is one of their early movie cameras. Ernst Mach. And so he would use photography to study the speed of sound. This is a jet breaking the sound barrier. Etienne Jules Marey. I want you to remember this name too. He did a lot of work photographing birds in motion, which played out ultimately into aircraft design and how wings work. This is his camera gun. He would photograph birds with it. And if you look top right, there's a photograph top right, and left down one, you can see shots of a horse with all his legs off the ground. And I think Stanford won the bet. This is E.T. and Marey, Zopraxicope. So here's an example of what I showed you earlier. This is a donkey kicking its heels up. So you can record things in motion. And here's the camera taking multiple pictures of the same thing. And now I will stop sharing. There. Now, the first time I recorded all of this, my screen share didn't work out well and the sound was nowhere. Today is Saturday. On Sunday, I will play this and see if it was successful. If it was, I'm going to send an email to all of you to now do technical improvements. And for those of you who are really into history, what is today? 9? What is today? I don't know what day it is until I look at my phone. Oh, 10, 11. Tuesday is the 50th anniversary of the crisis on Apollo 13. Something to tell your friends about. I want to thank you for watching this. Email me with questions. Otherwise, on Monday, I will have my office hours at 11 to noon. I apologize to all of you for missing my office hours 4 to 5, but something came up and I had to blast out of here. And I'll be recording pictorialism tomorrow. Thank you.